Oh, well, thanks. Several things run through my mind. This is the first time I've ever been introduced by someone who's not here. This has great potential, though. I'm thinking that there's real potential for making presentations and not having to show up, just kind of sitting down straight or whatever. And it hit me that, I taught in Elkins for years. I'm going to mention that in a second. But one of the big issues, the faculty always have is what do you do with laptops, iPads, all those in class? Do you let them use them or not? And it dawned on me as I was walking in, we've got a whole crew that is probably doing something other than this at this particular time. So the way I used to deal with this in Elkins, I just wander around and, out of my own curiosity, see what people were dealing with. I won't do that today. There's a bit of an oddity. I want to break this into two parts. The first is going to be somewhat personal and anecdotal, and then talk a little bit about some of the different things I've been reading and why they may or may not be relevant or helpful. But first, for those of you who know me, my field is really ancient languages, as my kids jokingly say. I do know a ton of languages, but they're, for me to talk to anyone, they'd have to dig up people who've been dead for 3,000 or 4,000 years, so they consider that not terribly helpful. But it taught me how technology over the years has an impact on all fields. For example, now virtually every text from the ancient world, I can have on my iPad or on my laptop, and that's pretty remarkable that you can carry around this huge database, and that becomes of some significance. Also, if you teach languages, like teaching ancient languages the way I learned Hebrew, you could spend hours and hours trying to figure out what the root of a word was. And the reason for that is Hebrew, to not bore you, but is what we call triliteral. Every Hebrew verb has 3 letters, but some letters are considered weak. And so you might be looking at a word that you don't know, and only one of the 3 original letters is there, and you've got to spend a tremendous amount of time figuring out which of the 2 letters that are missing so you can look the word up. That's long gone, because now you have to do is hold your finger on that word, and up pops the root word, and it tells you what it means, and so you don't have to dig around for hours in the dictionary. And then the question becomes, so how do you teach languages? A lot of research works I bought over the years that take up a lot of shelf space. You can now buy online, and so you can carry them with you, and that becomes pretty interesting. What I want to do, though, I do think it's interesting. The old saw, in my mind, used to be people went through PhD programs, and they came out of those programs having no idea how to teach, having learned anything about pedagogy. Now I hear increasingly the concern is people go through doctoral programs and come out having no idea what to do with technology when they go into the classroom. So it is an interesting dynamic. I want to kind of, may or may not be interesting, but I want to take a few minutes. I spent some time thinking about my own history with technology. I'll start by letting you know I have never had a course in computer science, anything related to technology. That'll become obvious, painfully obvious perhaps here in a minute. But the first time I had an experience with a computer was in 1984, I think. I was at the university, or had just moved to the University of Texas to teach. And I got invited to be part of a team that was working on a Bible translation project. And the way that they were doing that was translation was being made, and then I was to check and look at it and edit it accordingly. And so they sent me this old Apple computer and floppy disk, and I would go in and make corrections on the floppy disk and then mail them back to them. While I was in Austin, I think it must have been 85 or something like that, I bought my first computer. For those of you who are old enough to remember, I bought a Compaq. It was at that time the only portable computer. It looked like a sewing machine cabinet, and if you flipped open, remember the bottom, and you flipped down the keyboard and everything? I bought it because it was the only thing that was portable. And I really did, literally. I carried it back and forth from home and work every day, so you look like a traveling salesman or whatever. But it worked, and things were fine. The next experience I think that was of some interest was when I came to Pepperdine. I really got interested in what you might be able to do in presentation in the classroom. And so there was a program that came out called Toolbox, and it was an IBM product. And so I went to Santa Monica to an IBM learning facility with a group of people. And I don't know, what you all call yourselves or whatever, that are technologically savvy, techies or whatever. Everybody in the room was really a tech person, and I, again, had never had anything. It was a great experience. I had never written script, and so the first thing you're sitting there doing is they're going through telling you how to write script to make things happen on the screen. And it was one of these moments where I'm just scrambling to kind of keep up and trying to make sure, how many embarrassing questions do you want to ask, like what does X mean? And you're looking around and realizing everybody else is playing with the program, and they're 2 or 3 screens ahead, and the IBM people are trying to tell them to rein it back in and stick with them and everything. Now, that was a very good experience because it's always good for faculty, I think, to have reminders that when you get out of your immediate field, almost anyone can be made to feel or look like an idiot. And the things we often take for granted in the classroom, it's probably not helpful to do that. But anyway, I figured that one out. I learned how to write the script for that program. And again, some things transferred because I learned all you had to do was put one comma in the wrong spot or a semicolon, and it messed up everything. You had to go back in and correct it, which was somewhat akin to the way languages work. So I caught on, and I did that. And then the frustrating part was, having spent hours putting all those programs together and writing all that script, then no sooner did I do that, and a program came out called Astound. And what was so cool about Astound was it wrote all the script for you. And all you had to do was click a button if you wanted the screen to do this or to do that, and it would do it. And so I thought, wow, that's a phenomenal amount of time I spent that now isn't all that helpful, but it turned out okay. And I did that because I had started teaching in Elkins Auditorium. And my language was, I knew I couldn't go into Elkins unarmed. I mean, you couldn't just stand up there and lecture like I'm doing now. I intentionally decided to use no technology today for a variety of reasons, which I won't share. But I thought, okay, 2 things were happening. One, how could I use technology to keep the students engaged when you have 200 to 250 students? But the other one was, we had been running programs, or started running programs, where we were taking students to Israel for 10 and 11 days, and to Turkey and to Greece. And it was a phenomenal experience for our students where they, their whole worldview and their view of the Bible changed dramatically when they actually experienced the places they were going. And so I was trying to think, how could I recreate that in a classroom? And so I took Astound, which had lots of bells and whistles. PowerPoint at that time was as dull and boring as you can imagine. Still have a similar kind of view of that, but I won't talk about that. And so what I did was I started scanning thousands and thousands of photos so that I could create pictures and images in the classroom. Now, again, there were fun kind of moments. Very, very few people were doing that. In fact, I think probably I was one of the first, because I was the only faculty member who went to the Santa Monica experience. But I found, interestingly, that even people who weren't doing it suddenly felt like it was fair game to critique what you were doing. So they would critique pictures, they would critique color schemes, and tell me what was working and not working, which was fine, but you sort of live with that. But it did work, I think, because it got the students very much engaged, and so that was really kind of a fun moment. And I did that for years when I was teaching Elkins and then all my other classes. Obviously, PowerPoint just sort of crushed Astound and put it out of business, and so I had to move everything then to PowerPoint. I did that, but again, PowerPoint was still pretty dull, and so there was a company, a program called, or a group called Crystal Graphics, and they had all sorts of cool graphics, and the screens did all sorts of things. And I used that really primarily because I found it was a really fun way to keep the students engaged. I could put screens in and track to make sure they were doing. And so that was pretty neat. I found, again, it was wonderful. You could not only put pictures, you could put video clips in. I used to, in Elkins, sometimes I would start with a song. Like when we were doing Samson, I would play at the beginning of class a clip from the old Tom Jones Delilah, and we were off and running. That actually worked pretty well because, interestingly, I found students started sending me clips, music clips especially. Hey, have you heard this one? And so they're digging around to find biblical references and songs and things. And then I guess the last one I want to mention, then make the transition, is as I was kind of winding up in Elkins, clickers became pretty hot stuff. And so I started using clickers in Elkins, and what I found that was really, I think, pretty cool was that it was really hard, I found, to engage 200 students in discussion. If you asked a question, people just wouldn't respond. But with a clicker, where you asked a question and then clicked on what they thought the answer was, they were completely anonymous, but you could immediately see how many held their position, how many didn't. And so suddenly, students started talking in class because they realized if they had selected A as opposed to B, at least there were another 50 or 60 people in there who thought A was the correct answer or incorrect. And I would use it to start classes, to get them thinking about where we were going. I would use them sometimes to ask questions as we're tracking through to see if they're still with me or whatever. One of the things that was really fun was to use them to ask, see what their preconceptions were. So a classic kind of question I would often start with would be, how many of you think that the reason Adam and Eve got kicked out of the garden was Adam's fault, Eve's fault, God's fault, none of the above, this kind of thing? Why do you think the flood came? Everybody, would always go toward the flood happened because God was hacked off, which was a great way to start the thing because that's what everyone thinks, but it's wrong. It's just, it's very clear the flood happened because God was incredibly disappointed with people and decided he needed to do something. But disappointment's different from anger. Anyway, so that's kind of my history. Now I've had to morph over into a completely different area, thinking about technology. I mentioned that really for a couple of reasons. One, I want to let you all know how much I appreciate what you do, because my experience was it's pretty labor intensive and time intensive. And then secondly, as I went through this, it hit me how quickly things become dated. Clickers, all sorts of things. It's like, well, that's kind of cute. And but we don't think in those terms anymore. We now think in terms of apps and all that. So let me, as I read that, I guess my experience has been somewhat different than a lot that I hear from faculty, kind of talking about the problem with technology in the classroom. I found it actually was kind of fun, and I still think that in many ways. I find at times, you can make comments in class as if you're not quite sure what the answer is, and the students get engaged and start Googling around to find what might be the correct information. And then you can have, in my mind, a really wonderful conversation about how did you decide that this was a reliable source as opposed to that being a reliable source? How do you know that where you just got your information from didn't come from a junior high kid, who wrote a term paper, and is that really a reliable source? But it engages, I think, pretty helpful conversations about how do we use the internet, how do we access information, those kinds of things. It also helped me to realize that kind of the way I learn things, I'm pretty linear. I like things sort of lined up. A, B, C, D needs to run that way rather than B, C, A, D or something. But I found lots of students do not process that way. They can jump all over. And so it was kind of a great experience. So let me move and talk a little bit then about stuff I've been reading. Almost daily stuff comes across my desk now or through my email box. Not surprisingly, most of it, or a lot of it, has to do with technology. And much of it has to do with why I should buy their particular product for the university. I feel like, they think I've got a blank check or something sitting there, and everyone's got a reason why their product is far better than everyone else's. But in the course of that, it's been interesting to read a lot of this stuff that kind of comes through. So there was the retired CEO of Intel, his commencement address when he got an honorary doctorate at Stevenson Institute of Technology. I read it the other day. It's kind of fascinating. He comes at things very much like an engineer, or I think the way engineers come at things. He talks about the boundary points or whatever, and his first one was, competition is very hard. It's going to be hard work to succeed. Not exactly what I'm sure the graduates wanted to hear that day. His number two was market shares are won and lost in times of transition, and he goes through the kind of classic stuff. Think about Kodak, think about Nokia, we all know those. He talks about what's important today is how much value you add to what you do. That's a fascinating conversation, I think. What is the value of technology? And then, of course, it gets much more crass in my mind that money flows toward the high points. You know, competition is unimpeded, but money's going to go where they think they can get the best return. And then an interesting one, the 21st century, of course, from his standpoint, is the technology century. It's going to be all about information, biotech, things like that. So that's pretty fascinating. Of course, he thinks that the R1 universities are the national treasure of this university. Interesting for a place like Pepperdine. The others, one of the fun things is in these articles to see what their opening line typically is. So like one that recently came out, the title was "The 3 Trends to Create a Higher Education Earthquake." It's really interesting. You know, those of you who track these articles aren't surprised how often things like earthquake, tsunami is used for technology, which again I find kind of fascinating. The opening line in that article, it was in The Economist, was "The staid higher education business is about to experience a welcome earthquake." That's really kind of an interesting, collection of words there. And he talks about disruptive waves. Interestingly, the first wave that creates disruption is funding, a funding crisis in higher education. You'll find this one really rather fascinating. He says there are 3 costs that are really creating a major problem for us. The first one, and actually I think probably in here you all are 2 out of 3, and I get maybe 3 out of 3. The first one is technology is incredibly pricey. The second one is faculty salaries. And the third one is administrative costs. So those are the 3 big problems. He does acknowledge, thankfully, that one of the reasons that higher education is expensive is because the government's no longer subsidizing, and no one's talking about that. But he talks about the technological revolution, about online learning, and what we all know that what once was kind of the preserved education for a few is now very much democratized, and what that's going to look like. And then an interesting one, universities are being asked to change because the traditional university model, where we were sort of responsible for catching them from 18 to 22, and maybe for some graduate work, now universities are going to be seen as responsible for the educational process for a person's entire career. Educating, re-educating, training, retraining, whatever you want to call it. Again, the articles just keep coming. Inside higher ed, virtually every day when they come out, they have something. They did one called 3 Goals and 3 Challenges of Technology, Educational Technology. They talked about productivity. They talked about relevance. Again, that's one I want to hit at the very end. If in an age now where information can be gained more quickly and more information than we can produce in the classroom, what's the value of a university? Why does anyone need the university? Everything you need to know or need to access you can get on the web, so why would you have it? What's the relevance? I think that's a pretty significant question. And then access, who gets access to it? But let me mention, I want to jump in and kind of wrap with 2 things that I think are of most interest to me. The first one is, how many of you have read the whole discussion called the naked teacher, or the naked teaching cycle, or, kind of a few. It's really, as you might expect, it's genius, I think, to come up with a title like The Naked Teacher. I mean, you're going to sell a ton of books, whether the book's any good or not. But I've heard the presentation at a couple of higher ed conferences and then read some of it. What makes it fascinating, again, this is a person who came out of technology and moved into academia, but who argues, again, that the most important benefits of technology are outside the classroom. And the gist of the argument is, if you use technology really well, you can do with technology outside the classroom so many things that now you free up really significant chunks of time in the classroom for face-to-face interaction and really enhance it. And so that's the gist. He argues very strongly technology is a tool. It's not an educational strategy. He's got wonderful lines, like college is like an app for the mind. And in fact, one analogy he uses is the function of an app is when you click on Southwest or American Airlines or whatever, you really don't have any interest in what all the flight patterns are, or all the flights, where they're going, times, and that kind of stuff. What you really want to know is, how's my flight doing, and what do I need to do about it? And he says, in many ways, college is gathering this information, but figuring out how to access what's most relevant, for the kinds of things you're doing. Well, that's a pretty interesting notion. And so he grapples with, if college is simply, or a university is simply about transfer of knowledge, then our value diminishes. But the real value of a university is learning how to apply, how to synthesize, how to analyze, how to put things together, how to see connections. That's what the university is for, how to take knowledge that is ubiquitous and really put it into some kind of meaningful coordination or whatever. And so he even, again, I love kind of this stuff. The point of college is increasingly to prepare the mind for the unknown. I think it's a great line to at least reflect on or think about. He has another one. Your use of technology may increase your credibility with your students, but it cannot by itself increase their learning. And so he talks about, how does true learning take place? And again, the reason he's arguing the benefit of technology often is outside the classroom, although it can be in, is it now allows classroom time to evaluate the arguments, to analyze the data, to look at the validity of the materials gathered, to apply, to do active learning, role-playing, gamification, those kinds of things. I'll give you one example, then I'll go to the final point. So one of these classroom exercises, you have to kind of think about the context or the kinds of things he's teaching. The students are all prepared. They come prepared to make a presentation, and they're given a context that this is what you're going to do. You've got your presentation you have to think through, and you're going to be presenting this to a group of, and he identifies the group in New York City. Okay? They walk into the classroom, and he says, oh, by the way, things have changed. In 10 minutes, your presentation is not going to be to a group of executives in New York City, it's a group of executives in Tokyo. Okay? And they've got 15 minutes and now they make their presentation. I don't know what your reaction is to that. There's something rather fascinating about that. Can you take what you've got and figure out how to redo it based on all the different things you've put together? So let me conclude. The EDUCAUSE, in a different context, has talked about what it thinks the top 10 IT issues are going to be, or technology issues for universities. And increasingly now, because of my position, the world I'm living much more in is, so what do you do, how do you think about student outcomes, and how do you use technology to leverage that? So many of you probably know we've got the dashboard initiative, I think we call it, I forget what we call it, but anyway, I never worry about what it's called, I just look at it. But I think it's one of the most exciting things outside of the classroom that's going to be of great value to us, where we can slice and dice a tremendous amount of data about our students, and it allows us to look at information and say, okay, based on what we're seeing in these patterns, do we really have our curriculum, our courses sequenced in the right fashion? Is the course design really working? Because now you can look and see, again, to give but one example, we now have data that shows that you could take two students. One student has a 3.4, so the assumption by many of us would be this student is not at risk, and another student has a 2.9. But the data will show that the 3.4 student has avoided 3 really tough courses that are central to the major and been putting them off, okay? And the other student with the 2.9 has taken all 3 of those and done well in those courses. And so what that data would show is actually the 3.4 student may be more at risk educationally because the crucial courses she needs, she has avoided, while the other student has taken those courses and moving ahead. So that I find pretty fascinating. I think there's lots of information there. Then the other is simply reading this material, how we think about coordinating what's happening in technology and IT with the academic side of the house. One of the things I'm struck with is I think having IT in the academic side of the house, obviously I have a big stake in this because it rolls up to me, I think that's the right way to do it. In fact, at conferences, I increasingly find people who are amazed that we would put IT with the academic side of the house. And it's like, well, how do you make sure that everybody's in sync? But increasingly, that's what everyone is saying. If you really want to have, a really good educational program, you need to put those two together. So I want to conclude. First, I want to thank you all for all the hard work. It is greatly appreciated. Your willingness to engage if you are with IT, your willingness to help faculty and to work closely with them, I greatly appreciate. I think it makes a huge difference in the lives of faculty to know that there are people who are helping them, who are willing to do that. I think it generates, it really does create an environment where we talk about people being lifelong learners, and we have people who may not be in the classroom day in, day out, but clearly are engaged in lifelong learning. I think it's a great way to model that. Again, I'm very much appreciative for those of you who are in a traditional faculty position, your willingness to spend lots of time, because it is time consuming. I think it makes a huge difference with our students though. It changes the classroom experience. It allows us to engage them and help them. I'll end by saying, I think one of the issues we've got to become much better at is articulating the value of a traditional academic experience or educational experience in the university. Really, I agree. If the university is simply about transferring knowledge, then we're going to really lose our place. But I think what the university is really about is helping students gain wisdom. And wisdom is the ability to analyze and evaluate and understand what's relevant, what's not relevant, how to prioritize, and then make really good decisions based on that about how to move forward and how to be a, kind of a change agent for good in our societies. And so it seems to me if that's the business we're in, the one thing that you can't learn simply by jumping around on the internet is, how to decide good from bad as far as what you're looking at and those kinds of things, how to evaluate that kind of stuff. And that's what a university is really helpful for. To put it differently, how to gain wisdom. So hopefully we will use technology. It can be a competitive advantage. It's also a necessity, though, in many ways. And so I want to thank you. I very much appreciate everything you do for Pepperdine and for coming today. This is a big time commitment, so hopefully at least 3 or 4 will go away really happy at the end of the day as winners. So again, thank you for giving me the time. I appreciate everything you do for the school. Thank you.